In today's Gospel, our Lord points out that for those who are rich, it is very difficult, not because being rich in and of itself is wrong, but when we approach our riches in a human way, or as almost all moral theologians point out, it is impossible to persevere in the way of grace, because it is impossible to persevere in the way of virtue, because grace will be abandoned. And so the rich as well as the poor need the grace of God in order to administer that which their state in life has brought to them or deprived them of. For it is also true that through greed, a poor person can be worse off than many rich people. But one thing our Lord says of the rich, that it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of the needle. And the import of the gospel is often diminished, and this is a classic text. For it is said that the eye of a needle was one of the gates in the walls that surrounded Jerusalem that was very short and very narrow, and it was difficult to get through, and that the camel had to have some of its burden released. But that is to diminish the significance of our Lord's statement. For by every indication and according to every doctrine father who has spoken on the matter, he means quite literally that it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a sewing needle than for the rich to enter into the kingdom of heaven, because through our pride often we consider worldly riches and worldly things to be a sign of God's blessing, and then we begin to pursue them more and more and more, rather than to administer them with that generous spirit that can only be the fruit of the grace of God. And so ultimately, what our Lord is calling the rich to do here is to have a deep prayerful life, so that if they have that ability, and we must understand, like all things human, it is a God-given ability, but it is one that is very difficult to be administered properly without the grace of God. And so we must be willing to abandon all things. We must be willing always and everywhere not to count the things that we have in this world, but rather to always take an account of whether we are stockpiling riches in the world to come. And so let us constantly resolve, no matter what state God has called us into this life, let us constantly resolve to beg Him for His grace and His insight, so that we are constantly pursuing that which is most important. For our Lord sums up this gospel by ultimately saying that if we abandon everything, that is, abandon it in a human way and elevate it to a supernatural way. For when the Lord tells us that we are to abandon all family members, He does not mean literally that we are to consider them dross, but rather we are to love them, not by a human way, but by a supernatural way. Often we see this reflected when one passes from this life, and then it comes time to divide that which they have accrued in this life. How much bickering, how much family turmoil is caused by one pitting how much was left to them against the other. St. Alphonsus de Liguori says, would that most Catholics thought more supernaturally, and then they would leave most of what they have accrued in this life to Holy Mother Church. Especially, they would leave it in a manner by which the holy sacrifice of the Mass would be offered both for their own eternal salvation and the salvation of those that they leave behind when they part from this world. And so, even in those things, we must strive to live supernaturally, because unless we elevate our love, even of those whom we are called to love in a special way, elevate it to a supernatural level, then we begin to risk even our own eternal salvation. And so, let us strive always and everywhere to have that generous and sacrificial love for all God's children and for all of humanity, so that we may truly be certain we are on the path of eternal salvation and ultimately may receive that reward which the Lord has promised for those who serve him well in this life, because then they will come to enjoy him for all eternity in the life to come.
Fructum ventris tuum,